Now, the last thing to say is just this, and that is, notice I didn't give you methods. I gave you theological marks. I gave you, I think, pictures that are concrete enough that you could tell revival if you see it. And you say, well, how do you get revival? Well, I would say you go after those theological marks. You go to you preach for conviction of sin. You seek to recover the gospel. You ask God for anointed worship. You do extraordinary prayer. You evangelize. You do it. Whether God sends it to you or not is actually up to Him. And I'll just tell you two other quick things. The method, see, the 18th century revival, the Great Awakening with John Wesley and George Whitefield, look carefully and you'll see there was a method. There was an electrifying method. It was outdoor preaching. Nobody had ever done it, at least not in recent memory. And it was in a kind of established church situation where you had parishes and people were, it was electrifying, the outdoor preaching. It was a method. It was a way of doing something. It drew people together. It was fascinating. It was great, okay? There are other revivals in which outdoor preaching had nothing to do with it at all. The Great Awakening, well, not Great Awakening, it's not called that, but there was a revival in downtown New York. Some of you know about it from 1857, 1858, 1859. It was significant. Records are hard. It's hard to be absolutely sure, but many historians would say that back then New York City was only Manhattan. The other boroughs like Brooklyn and Queens were separate, and there were 800,000 people in New York City, and in a 2-year period, about 80,000 people joined the churches. So we're not just talking about decisions for Christ. At least 10% of the population of Manhattan in a couple of year period seems to have gotten converted and joined the churches. And that had nothing to do with outdoor preaching. It basically happened through noontime, lay-led prayer meetings that happened all over the city every single day. And people coming in and praying and hearing the gospel there, and they were drawn into the church that way. You can't, put it this way. Somebody once said, you can never get back into Narnia the same way twice. You got through the wardrobe once, it won't happen again. Same thing is true of revival. Martin Lloyd-Jones says, I remember him saying at one point, he says, one of the sad things about Wales, when he was growing up, he was a young man. There had been a tremendous revival in Wales just about 20 years earlier, before, when Lloyd-Jones was a child, there was a great revival. When he was going to the ministry 20, 30 years later, there were a lot of people who'd become Christians during the Welsh revival, and he said one of the tragedies was that they were stuck in the method, that it was very difficult to get people out of the methods that had worked. And so he said there were a lot of people who felt like the Spirit only works when we're singing these songs. These are the songs that God used, and this is the orchestration, and this is the kind of meetings, and we have to do it because that's how God did it. And you get stuck. You get stuck. You mustn't get stuck. You have to be utterly creative, because every single time revivals come, they come with some new method generally that's pretty intriguing and is very effective. But there's one other thing. God has to do it. And you say, well, of course God is sovereign. God often sends some sort of upheaval in the culture. There may be a revival going on in China. To some degree, if that's the case, it's to some degree because there's cultural upheavals. The great revival that happened at the beginning of the 20th century that brought Korea from a 0% Christian country into about a 40% Christian country, to some degree happened because of big cultural upheavals where the Japanese, had humiliated Korea and had conquered Korea basically, and it was a tremendous national loss of faith, and it was very, very difficult. And so, very often when there's a cultural crisis that God in His providence sends, there's the normal operations of the Holy Spirit get intensified. And so I don't want that to happen to America. I don't want that to happen to Canada. I don't want that to happen to the places where we are. But sometimes in God's providence, that might be what He does. Well, you don't pray for that. You pray for revival. You pray for revival, and you say, do whatever it takes. Do whatever it takes.